The morning Vera Colquhoun walked into the county meeting hall and set her mason jar of honey on the long pine table, the room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet before a verdict. 53 people stood in that hall, most of them farmers who had watched their fields craze and crack through 11 weeks without meaningful rain, and every one of them understood that the jar she placed at the center of the table was not a jar of honey so much as it was a jar of time. 48 hours, some of them had calculated. The specialist from the Regional Agricultural Board, a man named Dwight Calder, who wore his collar buttoned to the last button even in that terrible heat, had been talking for 20 minutes about consolidation frameworks and resource reallocation and sustainable futures for family farms. And through all of it, Vera had stood near the back wall, listening with the particular patience of someone who has already done the arithmetic and is waiting only for the other party to finish their version of it. Calder paused when he saw the jar. He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, the way the hive looks at you when you have not yet decided whether to be afraid. The real decision had already been made, though no one in that room knew it yet. Not by her exactly, by something older. The land had been deciding for 3 years. She had only been paying attention. 8 months before that morning, on a Wednesday in late October, that arrived cold and overcast and smelling of the river clay that lies beneath the topsoil on the east side of Harlan County, Vera Colquhoun pulled a borrowed pickup truck to the end of a dirt track and stopped in front of a house that had been described in the estate paperwork as a single-family farmstead in need of cosmetic improvement. The description was the kind that real estate professionals deploy when they mean something considerably worse. The porch had detached from the main structure on its western end and listed at an angle that suggested it was reconsidering its commitment to the house. 3 of the 4 front windows had been boarded, and the 4th had been boarded and then half unboarded, and then boarded again imprecisely, so that a wedge of glass showed like a missing tooth. The outbuildings were low and weathered to the color of a February sky, and behind them the land rolled away in 62 acres of old meadow, second-growth cedar, and what the estate paperwork called a managed apiary, which turned out to mean 14 derelict wooden hive boxes standing in 2 crooked rows in the meadow's southeast corner, and inside those boxes, if they contained anything at all, a population of bees that had been without a keeper for almost 2 years. Vera was 7 months pregnant. She had driven 4 hours to be here. She had $4,600 in a checking account and a cashier's check for $11,000 that represented the entirety of what her great-aunt Mabel's estate had produced after the debts were settled, minus what she had paid for the property itself, which had been $8,500 at a private sale through a probate attorney who had tried 3 times to discourage her. The arithmetic was not generous. 11,000 less than 8,500 gave her 2,500 free and clear. Add back the 4,600 in checking, and she had just over $7,100 to last her through the winter, through the birth, through whatever work the house demanded before it would be livable, and through the keeping of 14 boxes of bees that she did not yet know how to tend. She had taken a 2-day beginner's course at an extension office the previous summer on account of Mabel, who had been a keeper for 40 years, and from whom Vera had received exactly 3 lessons and an incomplete set of notes before the illness accelerated and the lessons stopped. She sat in the cab of the truck for a moment with the engine off and did the arithmetic again, the way she had been doing it since she was a girl, because numbers told you where you were even when the landscape refused to. 7,000 plus change against a winter and a birth and a house and a herd of bees that everyone she had spoken to had called the wrong kind of bees in the wrong kind of condition at the wrong kind of time. The extension agent in the next county over had been kind about it, but kind in the way that people are when they are trying to soften a foregone conclusion. Carniolan bees, he had said, feral tendency stock going on 2 years unmanaged in old woodenware, and you, a first-year keeper, going into winter. He had made a soft sound in his throat. She could sell the boxes to a commercial operation for scrap, he said. Maybe get $40 a box if she was lucky. She had thanked him and driven home and not mentioned it again to anyone. She got out of the truck and walked to the first hive box and pressed her ear against the wood. And even in October, even in the cold, she heard the low collective hum of something still alive inside. 40,000 lives, or thereabouts, packed in cluster against the dark. She straightened up and stood very still for a moment, with her hand flat against the box, and the baby turned inside her, the way the baby had been turning all afternoon, restless and searching, and Vera thought, we are all in boxes we did not entirely choose. She did not take the hand away. The town of Harlan Ferry had a hardware store, a feed co-op, a diner, and a bank branch, and the bank branch was where she went on her second day to introduce herself and open a local account. And the bank branch was where she met Dwight Calder for the first time, though she did not know yet who he was or why it would matter. He was standing at the counter, speaking with the branch manager in the low, assured voice of someone accustomed to speaking and being heard. And he glanced at her once when she came in and then looked away. And the looking away was the particular variety that means you have been assessed and found negligible. She was wearing work boots and a flannel shirt that no longer closed over her stomach, and her hair was pulled back without ceremony, and she watched him make his quiet appraisal, and she filed it away with the patience of someone who had been filed away before, and knew it cost the filers something they couldn't yet calculate. She heard his name when the branch manager used it. She heard the word consortium a few minutes later, and then the phrase significant holdings in the eastern parcels, and she understood in outline what kind of man he was before she knew a single particular. He left without acknowledging her. The branch manager, a harried woman named Deb Fossey, who was clearly not the author of her own afternoon schedule, apologized for the wait and helped Vera open her account. And when Vera mentioned the Mabel Shear farmstead on the East Road, Deb Fossey pressed her lips together in a configuration that Vera had learned to recognize as reluctant pity. She said, "Well, you've got gumption, I'll give you that." And Vera said thank you, because gumption was the best she could expect from this conversation, and she had known it before she walked in. The first month was the month of the house. She worked from first light to dusk and sometimes past it, peeling decades of wallpaper, pulling nails, replacing 2 sections of flooring that had gone soft with an old leak, and learning the bones of a structure that was sounder than it looked, which she took as a lesson about appearances that the house was offering free of charge. She found the room on a Thursday in her 4th week, behind a section of beadboard paneling in the second bedroom that rang hollow when she knocked and turned out to be held in place by 6 screws, rather than nailed, suggesting it had been meant to be opened again. Behind it was a low-ceilinged room, perhaps 9 feet by 11, insulated more carefully than the rest of the house, with 3 deep shelves along the far wall. On those shelves were mason jars, 111 of them in 3 sizes, each one sealed and labeled in her great-aunt's handwriting with a year and a code that Vera spent an evening deciphering. C for Carniolan, the hive box number, and the botanical source. The oldest jar dated from 19 years ago. Some of them had crystallized to amber solidity. Many were still clear and flowing. All of them were sealed airtight, and when she carefully opened one to taste it, it was neither fermented nor spoiled, but only very old and very floral, with a depth that stopped her still and made her stand in the middle of that low room with her eyes closed for a full minute. Mabel had been keeping a record. The room was the record. Vera looked at the shelves and felt, for the first time since the truck pulled up to the house, that she was not improvising, but inheriting a method. She sealed the room again and told no one. The arithmetic shifted. She added the contents of the room to a ledger she kept in her head. 111 jars of single origin, dated estate-kept honey from verified Carniolan stock on a named parcel of land in Harlan County, some of it nearly 2 decades old, all of it documented by the keeper's own hand. She did not know yet what it was worth. She suspected it was worth considerably more than $40 a box. Winter came hard and early, as if to test the proposition. The baby came on the 14th of December, in the upstairs bedroom, with a midwife named Ruth, who drove 40 minutes in the dark and charged $200 and was worth 10 times that. And the baby was a girl, and Vera named her Claire. She set Claire in the drawer she had padded and insulated and set near the wood stove, and she went back to work the next morning doing the lighter tasks she could manage, because there was no one else to do them, and the arithmetic of $7,000 and a winter that intended to last until April did not include the luxury of recovery time. The neighbor came in January. He appeared at the edge of the meadow on a bitter gray afternoon when Vera was out checking the hive boxes for the third time that week, tapping each one to hear whether the cluster had moved and whether the colony was burning through its stores too fast. She heard the creak of the fence gate and turned to find a man of perhaps 75 moving toward her through the snow with the careful, deliberate progress of someone whose joints have opinions about weather. He was wearing a coat that had been repaired in several places with what appeared to be different colors of thread, which gave him the look of an ongoing project rather than a finished one. He stopped at a respectful distance and examined the hive boxes with the slow attentiveness of someone who has seen the thing before. He said, in an accent that placed him somewhere in Central Europe, several decades and 10,000 miles away, "Those are carniolan girls, yes?" And she said yes. And he said, "They will be fine. They are cold-weather bees. They have better sense than the people who doubt them." His name was Emmerich Sludek, and he had kept bees in Moravia for 30 years before he came to this county, and he lived on 12 acres of old orchard 3/4 of a mile to the north. And he had known Mabel Shear for 20 years, and he had known, he said, that whoever came to that land after Mabel would either understand it or leave it, and either way it would be all right, because the land had a long memory and was not in any particular hurry. He looked at Vera with the calm attention of someone reading a tide chart and said, "Your great-aunt used to say that a beehive is not something you manage. It is something you learn to read." And she said, in that cadence, "When you finally hear what it is telling you, it will have been telling you for a long time already." He nodded once and said, "Yes, that is close." He stayed for an hour and drank coffee and said nothing about the pregnancy or the house or being alone, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for her since she arrived. He left and came back 3 days later with a wooden frame he had repaired and re-waxed and a small jar of propolis he had harvested the previous fall. And the lessons began. The boy appeared in March. His name was Tobias Wren, and he was 9 years old and lived 1.5 miles down the road in a house that was smaller than Vera's and in worse repair. And he arrived at her fence one Saturday morning and stood there in silence until she noticed him and said hello. He said, "I heard you have bees." She said she did. He asked if they were dangerous. She said they were bees, and bees were dangerous only if you were in a hurry. And he appeared to consider this for a long moment, and then climbed the fence and walked to the nearest hive box and stood in front of it and did not flinch when 3 bees emerged to investigate him. She let him stand there. He turned and said, "What's her name?" Vera said, "Well, there are about 40,000 of her." He said, "No, the big one. I can see a big one." She said, "That is a drone, and that one doesn't have a name yet." He thought about it and said, "Solomon." She allowed Solomon. After that he came every Saturday and some Wednesdays, and by April he knew all the hive boxes by their box number and had assigned a name to the visible drone in each one, and had decided that box 7, which was the furthest from the others and the quietest, was where the oldest souls lived. Vera did not correct this. She was not sure he was wrong. Spring opened slowly, grudgingly, the way springs do in high country, parceling out warmth like a suspicious creditor, and the carniolan bees built up their populations faster than Vera had expected, faster than the extension agent's prognosis had implied, because Emmerich had warned her that carnelians read the season earlier than other bees and expand with it, which meant the hives needed more room sooner, and she needed to be ahead of them. And she learned to read the bees the way he had taught her, walking the rows each morning before Claire woke, watching the flight patterns, noting the pollen color, listening for the particular vibration that meant crowding, adding boxes when the population demanded it, not before. By late May, she had 14 functioning colonies in new equipment added above the old boxes, with the original woodenware preserved as the base of each stack, because Emmerich had told her the old wood held the colony's history, and history was not something to throw away. On a Friday in early June, a woman named Lena Forsythe stopped at her farm stand. Vera had built the stand from salvaged boards and set it at the end of the track in the second week of May, offering the current season's honey in half-pound jars at $6, because that was approximately what the co-op was charging for the commercial blend, and she saw no reason to undersell it significantly before she understood the market. Lena Forsythe drove a car with out-of-county plates and was dressed in a way that indicated she was passing through rather than local, and she stopped for one jar out of curiosity and then stood at the stand for several minutes, tasting it on a small wooden spoon that Vera kept there for the purpose. And then she said, with a directness that Vera appreciated, "Where did your colonies overwinter?" Vera told her about the East Meadow and the carniolan stock. Lena Forsythe said she was a pastry chef in a city 4 hours north, and that she had been trying to find a single-origin raw honey from cold hardy stock for 2 years, because the flavor profile of a properly managed carniolan colony on a diverse meadow forage was distinct from anything the commercial market was producing, and she wanted 16 jars if Vera had them. Vera did have them. Lena Forsythe paid $12 a jar without being asked because, she said, the first price was a misunderstanding of the product. The total was $192, which was the most money Vera had received in a single transaction since she arrived, and she took it into the house and wrote it in the ledger and sat down at the kitchen table and rewrote the arithmetic from the beginning. The arithmetic now said something different than it had in October. It said 14 colonies producing at current rates through a full season at $12 per half-pound jar to a food service buyer who understood the product, with a secondary market for the single-origin aged reserve from the hidden room, to buyers who would pay a great deal more for documented provenance and depth of flavor, would produce a number sufficiently different from the previous number that Vera allowed herself, for the first time since she arrived, to imagine staying. She told Emmerich. He sat with the information for a moment, and then said, "The bee knows before the keeper knows. She was already doing this. You were only just beginning to read." He looked at Claire, who was 6 months old and sitting in a padded basket near the door, examining a wooden spoon with the complete seriousness that infants bring to objects. He said, "Your great-aunt kept a long record for someone. She wanted the land to be read correctly." Vera said, "I think she was waiting for the right reader." Emmerich said nothing, but he looked at the jar on the table, and his expression was the expression of a man who recognizes a thing being completed. Dwight Calder came back in July. He came in the same late model car he'd been using to work his way through the eastern parcels all spring, and he stopped at the farm stand and bought a jar at the standing price without identifying himself. And then 2 weeks later, he sent a letter on consortium letterhead offering to purchase the entire apiary operation, including the land for a number that was, in absolute terms, not unreasonable for farmland in Harlan County, but was, in terms of what the operation was now producing and what the reserve room held, an offer structured by a man who believed he was still dealing with the woman who had arrived in October. She wrote back a single line declining the offer and did not add explanation, because the letter required none. He came in person in August. He sat in her kitchen and spoke for 20 minutes about the difficulties facing independent small farm operations, about the consortium's stewardship commitments, about the opportunities available to a woman in her position. which phrase he used twice, each time in a tone that was meant to suggest he was identifying a vulnerability he was gracious enough not to exploit further. She offered him coffee and let him speak. At the end she said, "The operation isn't for sale." He looked at her kitchen, at Claire in the basket, at the jars on the shelf, and he said, "I want you to know the offer stands and the number's flexible." She said, "I appreciate that." He left. She watched the car go down the track, and she thought about what it meant that the number was flexible, and she went back to work. He began to work on the community the way water works on stone, which is to say patiently and without announcing itself. She heard about it through Tobias first, who reported without elaboration that some men at his father's shop had said the bee operation on the East Road was going to get bought out by end of summer. She heard it through Deb Fossey at the bank, who called her on a Thursday to mention that there was some talk at the Planning Commission about access road classifications on the East County properties, which was the kind of procedural language that meant someone had asked someone to look at something. She heard it from Emmerich, who said simply, "He has been to see the Purvis operation and the Blanchard operation and the Dreyer operation, and he has a piece of each one now, and when enough pieces are one person's pieces, that person does not need to own your piece to make it very difficult for your piece." This was the most words she had ever heard Emmerich use in a single sentence. She understood he was telling her something he considered important. She said, "How long has the county been without a drought?" He looked at her and said, 3 years of below-average rainfall." She said, "Where does the Purvis operation water from?" He said, "The creek." She said, "And the Blanchard and Dreer?" He said, "Same watershed." She let the silence do what it needed to do. He finally said, "The bees do not need the creek." She said, "No, they don't." The summer accelerated toward its crisis the way summers sometimes do, not with announcement but with accumulation, each dry week adding itself to the previous dry week until the weight of them was visible in the ground. By the first week of September, the creek was running at a quarter of its usual width. By the third week, it was a series of disconnected pools. The corn in the Purvis fields went white at the tips, and then through the full progression that farmers know by heart and would prefer not to, and the pasture grass on the Blanchard and Dreher operations turned the yellow of old newsprint. And the cattle in those fields stood at the fence lines and waited with the waited patience of animals that know something has changed. Vera's bees did not wait. The Carniolan bees had already, over the preceding weeks, been foraging the late-season wildflowers in the cedar margins of the East Meadow, working the goldenrod and the ironweed and the late clover on the creek's far bank at the limits of their range. And the honey they were producing in September had a darker, more complex quality than the summer honey, and she was jarring it and labeling it and stacking the jars in the reserve room with its temperature stability and its old wood shelves, and she was banking it like a coal kept low under ash, waiting for the moment to show it to the light. Tobias came on a Wednesday in early October, a school day, which was unusual, and he said, "Mr. Calder was at the meeting last night, and he told everyone that the only water source that was going to be functioning through October was the well on the Harlan Ferry Co-op property, and that the co-op was going to be allocating water access by membership tier, and that the membership tier restructuring was going to be announced next week." Vera said, "Who was at the meeting?" He listed them, 12 farmers by name, the planning commission chair, the branch bank manager, and 2 men he didn't recognize who stood in the back and didn't talk. She said, "Was Emmerich there?" He said, "Mr. Sladek doesn't go to those meetings." She said, "No, he doesn't." She walked that afternoon with Claire in a carrier on her chest and Tobias keeping pace beside her to Emmerich's orchard. She told him what Tobias had reported. He listened without interruption and then looked at the sky for a moment and said, "The co-op well is a dug well, not deep, and in a dry October, its yield will be approximately 40% of what people will need. And the membership tier restructuring means Calder's consortium parcels will have first-tier access, and the independent operators will have third-tier access, which in a 40% yield situation means approximately nothing. She said, "Yes." He said, "And you have the spring." She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Your great-aunt had a saying about the water. It was, 'The spring belongs to whoever read the land well enough to find it.'" Vera said, "Did she find it, or did it find her?" He said, "She would have said, 'There is no difference.'" The spring was in the northeast corner of the east meadow, in a low stand of Osage orange and wild plum, and it had been there long before the house, fed by a confined aquifer that ran under the limestone shelf of the meadow's north edge, independent of the surface drainage. Mabel had known about it. It was in her notes, oblique, but legible to someone paying attention. The northeast corner holds without asking, meaning it held water without irrigation, without rainfall dependency, without the creek. Vera had found the reference in February and had walked to the northeast corner in the March mud, and identified the seep where the ground stayed dark and the sedge grew dense and the soil had a different feel underfoot, and she had understood what it was and said nothing. She had told no one, not even Emmerich until now. She said to Emmerich, "I need to know what it will yield under consistent draw." He said, "I know a man who can calculate it and will keep his counsel." She said, "How long do you need?" He said, 2 days. The calculation came back. The spring, with minimal improvement to the natural seep, would yield approximately 60 gallons an hour on a sustained basis, which was not abundant but was consistent, and was, in the drought conditions of that October, the difference between animals surviving and animals not surviving on several operations in the county. She looked at the number for a long time, and then she thought about the meeting at the county hall that Calder had already scheduled for the following Friday, and she thought about the water access tier announcement he intended to make at it, and she thought about what it meant that Tobias's careful count of the people in that room was short by exactly 2, Vera Colquhoun and Emmerich Slottick, who had not been invited. She invited herself. Marcus Purvis came to her the Thursday before the Friday meeting. He drove up the track without calling, which told her the situation had progressed past the point where formality felt available to him, and he sat in the truck for a moment before getting out, which told her something about what the visit was costing him. He was 54 years old and had been farming the Purvis operation for 30 years. And he had been at the auction when she bought the farmstead, and had said, loudly enough to be heard by the 4 people standing nearest to him, that whoever bought that bee situation was going to be educated fast about the difference between a hobby and a living. She remembered the comment the way you remember things that are intended to instruct you in your smallness, not with bitterness exactly, but with precision. He got out of the truck and stood with his hat in his hands and said, "I've got 47 head of cattle, and the creek is gone, and I've got 3 days of water in the tank." Vera said, "Come in." He came in and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the jars on the shelf and said nothing about them. She gave him coffee. He said, "I heard a rumor about your northeast corner." She said she'd like to know where he heard it, and his expression shifted very slightly in a way that told her it had been Calder. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. She said, "When did you hear it from him?" He said, 2 weeks ago." She said, "And what did he tell you?" He said, "He told me it wouldn't be enough to help anybody and that he was mentioning it, so I understood my options were limited." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Marcus, how precise was his description of the yield?" He said, "It was a marginal seep, maybe 20 gallons an hour." She said, "The figure I have is 60. He was quiet. She said, "I want to know how he arrived at 20. He looked at his hat. He said, "I don't know." She said, "I think you do." He said, "There was a man out that way about 6 weeks back. I thought he was surveying for the road project." She said, "There was no road project." He put the hat on the table. She told him what the spring would yield. She told him what she intended to offer at the meeting the next morning, which was access to the spring at no charge in exchange for labor contribution to improve the access path and install the minimal collection structure it needed, apportioned by head of stock, so that nobody took more than their share and the smallest operations got priority in the queue. She told him the only condition was that the agreement had to be direct between herself and each individual farmer, not mediated through any consortium structure, because the mediation structure was the mechanism by which people would end up owing something they didn't intend to owe, and she wanted that understood before the meeting. He sat with this for a moment. He said, "Why are you doing this for us?" She said, "Because the spring is in the ground, and the cattle are living, and this is the use the thing was made for." He said, after what people said, she said, "That was people doing what people do when they're frightened of something new. You're frightened of something real now. It's a different situation." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands once more and said, "I'll be at the meeting." She put Claire in the carrier and drove to the county hall the next morning and set the mason jar on the pine table, and the room went quiet, and Calder, standing at the far end with his consolidated tier chart and his co-op access schedule, looked at the jar and then at her with an expression that moved through several territories very quickly: surprise, reassessment, and then the particular stillness of a man recalculating a position. She let him finish his presentation. She let the tier restructuring proposal sit in the air for 30 seconds after he was done. Then she said, "Before we discuss water access, I'd like to ask Mr. Calder one question." He nodded, gracious, because he did not yet know what it was. She said, "What is your estimate of the yield from the spring on the northeast edge of the sheer farmstead parcel?" He said, without hesitation, "Marginal, maybe 20 gallons per hour, not a viable source for large-scale livestock operations." She said, "Thank you." And then she turned to the room and she said, "I have a certified calculation here." She held it up. She said, 60 gallons per hour, sustained. She looked at Calder. She said, "The only way to arrive at 20 is to measure it from the near edge without following the seep to its main expression, which is 20 yards further north. The near edge is where a man was standing 6 weeks ago. I didn't see him from the house because the Osage orange is dense there, but my neighbor's boy counted the footprints. 12. That is one man twice, because he wore the same boots. She set the calculation on the table next to the honey. She said, "The spring is available to every operation in this room on the terms I'm about to describe, starting tomorrow." The room was completely still. Calder said, "I want to note for the record that any use of that spring as a community resource requires formal easement documentation through the Planning Commission, and I would strongly advise against informal arrangements that could expose participating parties to liability." She said, "The easements are already drafted. I had them done last Tuesday." She set 3 pages beside the calculation. She said, "Anyone who wants to look at them may." She had had them done by a property attorney in the county seat who had charged her $400 and told her they were airtight, which was the best $400 she had spent since the midwife. Calder looked at the documents. He looked at the room. The room was looking at the documents and at Vera, and not at Calder, and the looking was the kind that signals a completed transaction, the way a flock of birds turns all at once on a current of air that only they can feel. He picked up his presentation materials from the table. He said, "I'll note my objection to the process and reserve the consortium's right to formal comment through appropriate channels." Marcus Purvis said, "Noted." He did not look at Calder when he said it. Calder left. The door closed. Nobody watched it close. She spent the rest of the morning at the table explaining the access schedule and answering questions and signing easement copies and watching the room reorganize itself around a new geometry in which she was not at the edge but at the center, not because she had pushed toward the center, but because the center had moved. An older woman named Hetty Dreher, who had not spoken during the Calder portion of the meeting, and who Vera knew had been one of the voices at the auction speculating about how long a lone woman and a hive of bees would last on the East Road, came to her before she left and said, "You did right by us," Vera said. "The spring did right by us." Hetty Dreher looked at her for a moment and said, "Same thing, in your case." Vera thought about that on the drive home, with Claire asleep in the carrier and the sky beginning to show, for the first time in 11 weeks, the textured gray of clouds that meant something other than heat. That afternoon she opened the reserve room and looked at the shelves for a long time, at Mabel's jars and her own jars side by side, at the record of years and plants and hive boxes, and careful labeling in 2 different hands, and she thought about what it meant to inherit not just a property, but a method, not just land, but a way of reading the land that had been waiting in that boarded room for the right person to unboard it. She brought out 12 of the oldest jars from the first decade of Mabel's record, and she drove to Emmerich's orchard and set them on his table without explanation. And he looked at them for a long moment with the slow recognition of a man seeing something he thought was gone come back. And he said, "She kept everything." Vera said she kept everything. He said nothing more, but he put one hand briefly on the row of jars, and then he sat down. And she thought he might be close to crying, but she was not certain, and she did not look directly. She said, "You told me in January that the land has a long memory." He said, "Yes?" She said, "I think that's what the room is." He said, "Yes?" She stayed for an hour and drank coffee, and they talked about the spring schedule and the winter prep for the hives, and the probability that the rains would come in November, which Emmerich said the fruit trees were predicting with some confidence because the apple drop had been early and complete, which was what the trees did when they were preparing for a hard, wet winter and wanted to travel light. She believed him. She had learned, in the month since January, to believe the things that came from reading rather than from noise. The rains came on the 4th of November, a slow, solid 3-day rain that raised the creek bed and settled the dust and turned the east meadow the deep green of a place that has been waiting. And she stood in the rain with Claire on her hip and let it fall on both of them because Claire was 11 months old, and it seemed important that she should know what the rain felt like when it was welcome and real. Tobias appeared at the fence gate in his school coat, soaked through, and opened the gate and walked to the hive boxes, and stood before box 7 with his hands in his pockets. She called to him, "Is Solomon in there?" He put his ear against the wood and listened, and then turned and said, "They're all in there, all the old ones." She said, "Good. They know when to stay in." He said, "Is it going to be all right now?" She said, "For this year." He nodded as if this were a complete and satisfactory answer, which she thought it was. Emmerich came at the end of November to help winterize the hives, which meant reducing the entrances and securing the covers, and leaving the bees to the long work of winter that needed no supervision, only the confidence that the cluster knew what it was doing. While they worked, he said, "Your great-aunt had another saying that I did not tell you in January because I thought you needed to find it yourself first." She said, "What was it?" He wrapped a tie strap around the last box and cinched it carefully and said, "The hive does not need the keeper to believe in it, but the keeper who stops believing does not last. You lasted." She looked at the row of boxes in the gray November light. 14 stacks of old wood and new wood together, with 40,000 lives in each one, doing the arithmetic of winter in the dark. She said, "They're good bees." He said, "They are the right bees for this ground," which is another way of saying the same thing. She allowed this. She allowed most things Emmerich said because he had earned his precision the way old things earn precision, by having been tested by enough winters to know what holds and what doesn't, and by having decided to keep on reading even when the reading was difficult. She looked at the meadow and thought about the spring under its shelf of limestone, holding its 60 gallons per hour in the dark and the cold, not needing anyone to believe in it, not waiting for a verdict, only continuing. The way water continues, the way bees continue, the way land continues its long, slow argument for patience in the face of everything that is loud and certain and temporarily in charge. The meadow held the gray light of late autumn the way a jar holds honey, carefully, without effort, and without any intention of letting go.
Et bonjour! Mais non, faut pas que vous mettiez les bonjours pendant la scène de démarrage. Putain, va falloir que je vous rajoute la scène, des alertes dans la scène de démarrage. Mais après, je les vois pas moi. 12h20, je dois partir. Mais il y a pas de souci Alix, t'inquiète pas. T'inquiète pas, t'inquiète pas. Excusez-moi, hein. J'ai pas de réseau là où je vais livrer. Oh merde. Ah mais tu passes pas la journée, si je on fait ce qu'on peut. Ouais, moi aussi je fais ce que je peux. Tu vas faire quoi Alix, si c'est pas indiscret? C'est peut-être indiscret, hein. Ah bah voilà, ça va Sige. Bon, pour ceux qui peuvent, prenez votre petit café, votre petit thé, votre petit chocolat, vous le savez, ce matin c'est, tranquillou, tranquillou, tranquillou. Ah oui, moi je pensais que tu mais tu embauches, normalement tu commences plus tard, Alix, non? J'ai eu du mal à me lever. Hem, du coup, programme, aujourd'hui on est bien sur The Seven Deadly Sins, on va continuer. Demain il y a une maintenance, j'ai pas ouvert encore le jeu, mais demain il y a une maintenance donc on fera autre chose. Et puis voilà. J'ai essayé alors je suis désolée pour ceux qui ont suivi l'histoire principale. Bon, il y en a beaucoup d'entre vous qui sont déjà au courant, mais en fait, j'ai été obligée d'avancer un petit peu parce qu'il y avait l'événement pour avoir Méliodas. J'ai donné tout ce que j'ai pu. J'ai donné tout ce que j'ai pu, les copains m'ont aidée, Sige, Alix, Teddy.